Stay out of my territory.
Sanctions are a tool used by governments and international organizations to exert pressure on a targeted country or entity in order to achieve a desired outcome. They can take various forms, including economic sanctions, which are designed to restrict trade and financial transactions, or military sanctions, which are used to limit the military capabilities of a nation. Sanctions have been used for decades as a way to address issues such as human rights violations, nuclear proliferation, and terrorism. However, their effectiveness has been a subject of debate among policymakers and analysts. Some argue that sanctions can be an effective means of coercion, while others argue that they can have unintended consequences and often fail to achieve their desired goals. In this script, we will explore the history of sanctions and examine their effectiveness in achieving their intended outcomes. Part 1: History of Sanctions. The use of sanctions as a tool of international diplomacy can be traced back to ancient civilizations, where they were used as a means of punishment or retribution. In modern times, sanctions have been used extensively as a way to exert pressure on nations to change their policies or behavior. One of the first modern examples of sanctions was the embargo imposed by the United States on Japan in 1940, which was designed to limit Japanese expansion in Asia. The embargo effectively crippled Japan's economy and played a significant role in the country's decision to attack Pearl Harbor. Since then, sanctions have been used extensively as a way to address a variety of issues, including human rights violations, nuclear proliferation, and terrorism. The United Nations, UN, has played a significant role in the development and implementation of sanctions, often working with member states to impose economic sanctions on targeted countries. Part 2: Types of Sanctions. There are several types of sanctions that can be imposed on a targeted country or entity, including economic sanctions, military sanctions, and diplomatic sanctions. Economic sanctions are designed to restrict trade and financial transactions with the targeted country. These can include bans on exports and imports, restrictions on financial transactions, and asset freezes. Economic sanctions are often used as a way to exert pressure on a country to change its policies or behavior, as they can have a significant impact on the targeted country's economy. Military sanctions are used to limit a country's military capabilities and can include arms embargoes, restrictions on military training, and bans on the sale of military equipment. Military sanctions are often used as a way to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction or to address issues of conflict and instability. Diplomatic sanctions are used to restrict diplomatic relations with the targeted country. These can include the recall of ambassadors, the suspension of diplomatic relations, and the expulsion of diplomats. Diplomatic sanctions are often used as a way to signal disapproval or to send a message to the targeted country. Part 3: Effectiveness of Sanctions. The effectiveness of sanctions is a subject of debate among policymakers and analysts. Some argue that sanctions can be an effective means of coercion, while others argue that they often fail to achieve their desired goals. One of the main arguments in favor of sanctions is that they can be a powerful tool for changing a country's policies or behavior. Economic sanctions, in particular, can have a significant impact on a country's economy and can be a powerful incentive for the targeted country to change its policies. However, critics of sanctions argue that they often have unintended consequences and can be counterproductive. For example, economic sanctions can harm innocent civilians and can lead to widespread suffering, which can lead to increased support for the targeted regime. Additionally, sanctions can often lead to a decline in the standard of living for the general population, which can lead to widespread discontent and even revolution. It's a question that has been asked by many, and the answer may surprise you. The country with the most sanctions imposed upon it is not a small, developing nation, but rather a global superpower, the United States of America. That's right, The United States has the most sanctions of any country in the world, with over 40 countries currently under some form of economic or financial restrictions imposed by the US government. These sanctions are often used as a tool of foreign policy, and are meant to punish countries for their perceived wrongdoings, such as human rights abuses, nuclear proliferation, or terrorism. One of the most well-known examples of US sanctions is the embargo against Cuba, which has been in place since the 1960s. The embargo was implemented in response to Cuba's communist government and its close ties to the Soviet Union. It has been partially lifted in recent years, but many restrictions still remain in place, including a ban on most exports to the island nation and a ban on Americans traveling there. Other countries that have been subjected to US sanctions include Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Russia. The sanctions against Iran are perhaps the most comprehensive and wide-reaching, with restrictions on trade, financial transactions, and even travel. These sanctions were put in place to punish the Iranian government for its nuclear program, which the US and other Western powers believed was being used to develop nuclear weapons. North Korea has also been subjected to numerous sanctions due to its nuclear weapons program, and its human rights abuses. The US has imposed restrictions on exports to North Korea, as well as a ban on Americans traveling there. In addition, the US has frozen the assets of many North Korean companies and individuals, making it difficult for them to do business with the outside world. Syria has been under US sanctions for many years, with restrictions on exports and financial transactions, as well as a ban on Americans traveling there. The sanctions against Syria are meant to punish the Syrian government for its human rights abuses and its involvement in the ongoing civil war in the country. Finally, Russia has been subjected to US sanctions in recent years due to its annexation of Crimea, its interference in the 2016 US presidential election, and its support for separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine. The sanctions against Russia have included restrictions on trade and financial transactions, as well as a ban on Americans traveling there. So there you have it. The United States has the most sanctions of any country in the world, with over 40 countries currently under some form of economic or financial restrictions imposed by the US government. These sanctions are often used as a tool of foreign policy, and are meant to punish countries for their perceived wrongdoings. While they may not always be effective, they do serve as a powerful message to these countries that the US will not tolerate certain behaviors. While sanctions are often viewed as a way to address global issues and promote peace and stability, they are also a controversial topic, with some arguing that they can have unintended consequences and may not be the most effective way to address complex international issues. In this script, we will explore the pros and cons of sanctions, examining their effectiveness in achieving their intended goals and the potential consequences of their use. Body.